The morning sun barely touched the walls of Windsor Castle when something happened that no one was supposed to see. It was a quiet Tuesday, the kind of day when tourists lined the gates with cameras, hoping for a glimpse of royalty. Inside the castle grounds, the changing of the guard had just finished. The ceremonial soldiers stood at attention, their red uniforms bright against the gray stone walls. But in the East Garden, away from the crowds, a different kind of scene was unfolding. A young guard named Thomas Hartley stood frozen near the Rose Garden gate. His face had gone pale. His hands, usually steady, trembled at his sides. In front of him stood a man in an expensive suit. The man's face was red with anger. His voice cut through the peaceful garden like a knife. "You have any idea who I am?" the man shouted. "I could have you removed from service with one phone call." Thomas said nothing. His eyes stayed forward, trained on the distance, the way he'd been taught. But anyone watching could see the shame burning in his cheeks. The man stepped closer. "You're nothing but a decoration. A toy soldier in a costume, behind a hedge of white roses." Someone else was watching. Princess Charlotte had been walking with her nanny when she heard the shouting. She was only 8 years old. She recognized cruelty when she heard it. If you love stories about courage and kindness, hit that subscribe button now. You won't want to miss what happens next. Charlotte's nanny tried to guide her away. "Your Highness, we should go inside." But Charlotte didn't move. She watched the scene with sharp, intelligent eyes. Eyes that had seen how her great-grandmother, the late Queen, always treated people with dignity. Eyes that had watched her father speak to every person, from prime ministers to gardeners, with the same respect. The man in the suit was still shouting, "You stepped in my path. Do you understand how disrespectful that is?" Thomas finally spoke, his voice quiet. "I apologize, sir. I was following my patrol route." "Your patrol route?" The man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I don't care about your route. When someone like me walks through, you move. You disappear." Charlotte's small hands clenched into fists. The man leaned in closer to Thomas. "I'm Lord Chamberlain's cousin. I have access to your superiors. I could end your career before lunch." That's when Charlotte stepped out from behind the roses. Her nanny gasped, "Your Highness, please," but Charlotte was already walking toward the two men. Her small shoes clicked on the stone path. She wore a simple blue dress, and her hair was pulled back with a ribbon. She looked like any 8-year-old girl, except she'd Wells. The man in the suit turned, ready to snap at whoever was interrupting. But when he saw who it was, the words died in his throat. Charlotte stopped a few feet away. She looked up at the man with calm, steady eyes. Then she turned to Thomas. "Good morning," she said to the guard, her voice clear and polite. Thomas's eyes widened. Protocol demanded he not speak to royals unless spoken to first. "Good morning, Your Highness," he managed. Charlotte smiled at him. A real smile, warm and kind. Then she turned back to the man in the suit. What she said next would be whispered. About in palace halls for years to come, the garden had gone. Completely silent. Even the birds seemed to be. Holding their breath, the man in the suit stared down at Princess Charlotte. His mouth opened, then closed. For a moment, he looked like he might bow or apologize or simply run away. Charlotte didn't give him the chance. "I don't believe we've met," she said. Her voice was polite, but there was something else underneath it. Something steady and unshakable. "I'm Princess Charlotte." "Yes, Your Highness." "I know," the man stammered. "And you are." Charlotte interrupted gently. The man straightened his tie. Some of his confidence returned. "I'm Geoffrey Hartwell. I'm an advisor too, and this is Thomas Hartley," Charlotte continued, as if the man hadn't spoken. She gestured to the guard. "He protects my family. Every day. In all weather. He stands for hours without moving. He's very good at his job." Thomas's face flushed. He kept his eyes forward. There was something new in his expression. Surprise. Hope. Geoffrey Hartwell shifted uncomfortably. "Your Highness, there was a misunderstanding. The guard here was doing his job," Charlotte finished. She tilted her head slightly. "Isn't that right, Mr. Hartwell?" The man's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being corrected. especially not by a child, even a royal one. Charlotte's nanny stood frozen by the roses. She'd been with the royal family for 3 years, but she'd never seen anything like this, Your Highness. Geoffrey tried again, his voice smoother now. I'm sure we can all just— My great-grandmother once told me something, Charlotte said. She took a small step forward. She said that how we treat people when no one important is watching shows who we really are. Geoffrey Hartwell's face went pale. Charlotte continued, her eyes never leaving his. But someone was watching. Mr. Hartwell, I was watching. The weight of those words settled over the garden like snow. Thomas Hartley stood perfectly still, but inside, his heart was pounding. He'd served the royal family for 3 years. He'd guarded princes and princesses, duchesses and dukes, but he'd never been defended by one. Geoffrey Hartwell looked around as if searching for help, but the garden was empty except for the 4 of them. His expensive suit suddenly seemed too tight. His confident posture crumbled. I apologize, Your Highness. I was having a difficult morning, and you should apologize to him, Charlotte said quietly. She nodded toward Thomas. The silence stretched out. Geoffrey Hartwell looked at the guard. His pride fought with his common sense. He was a powerful man, connected to important people, but standing in front of him was a child who would someday be part of the most famous family in the world. He knew which choice he had to make. Geoffrey turned to Thomas. I apologize, he said stiffly. I was out of line. Thomas nodded once. Apology accepted, sir. Charlotte smiled. Thank you, Mr. Hartwell. That was very grown-up of you. There was a flash of something in Geoffrey's eyes, embarrassment, anger, but he nodded and turned to leave. Mr. Hartwell, Charlotte called after him. He stopped and turned back. Charlotte's expression was serious now. The guards here are the bravest people I know. They'd protect us with their lives. I hope you'll remember that next time. Geoffrey Hartwell nodded slowly. Then he walked away, his footsteps quick on the stone path. When he was gone, Charlotte turned back to Thomas. What happened next surprised everyone. Thomas Hartley had been trained for almost every situation. Protocol for meeting dignitaries. Procedures for security threats. Responses to medical emergencies, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. Princess Charlotte stood in front of him. This small girl in a blue dress, who had just defended him against a man 3 times her age. Are you all right? She asked him. Thomas blinked. Royals didn't usually ask guards personal questions. The relationship was professional, distant. Guards were supposed to be invisible. Yes, Your Highness, he said quietly. Thank you. Charlotte studied him with those intelligent eyes. He was mean to you. It's part of the job sometimes, Your Highness. It shouldn't be, Charlotte said firmly. Her nanny finally found her voice. Your Highness, we really should be going. Your mother will be looking for you. Charlotte nodded, but didn't move yet. She looked up at Thomas again. My papa says that the guards are the backbone of our family. He says, we couldn't do any of our work without you. Thomas felt something tight in his chest loosen. That's very kind, Your Highness. And it's not kind if it's true, Charlotte said simply. Then she smiled. Have a good day, Mr. Hartley. She turned and walked back toward her nanny, her small hands slipping into the older woman's grasp. Thomas watched them go, his mind spinning. What had just happened? He'd been a guard for 3 years. In that time, he'd been ignored, occasionally thanked, sometimes photographed by tourists, but never defended, never protected. The irony wasn't lost on him. He returned to his post, but his hands had stopped shaking. The shame that had been burning in his chest had transformed into something else, something warmer inside the castle. Charlotte's nanny was finally breathing normally again. Your Highness, she said carefully, that was very brave, but also very unexpected. Charlotte looked up at her. He needed help, yes, but— The nanny struggled for words. Mr. Hartwell is connected to important people. Your mother might not be happy that you confronted him. Mama taught me to stand up for people, Charlotte said. She does it all the time. The nanny couldn't argue with that. The Princess of Wales was known for her advocacy work, for using her voice to help others, like mother, like daughter, They walked through the long corridors of Windsor Castle. Portraits of Charlotte's ancestors watched from the walls, kings and queens who had ruled for centuries. Charlotte looked up at them as she passed. She wondered if any of them had ever defended a guard. By lunchtime, the story had spread, not to the newspapers or the public, but through the castle staff, the way such stories always traveled. A maid told a butler told a cook told a driver. By the time Princess Catherine sat down for afternoon tea, she'd heard 3 different versions of what happened in the East Garden. She called for Charlotte. When her daughter entered the room, Catherine studied her carefully. Charlotte's expression was calm, but there was a flicker of worry in her eyes. "Come sit with me," Catherine said gently. Charlotte climbed onto the chair across from her mother. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. Catherine poured tea into 2 cups. She added milk to Charlotte's the way her daughter liked it. "I heard you had an interesting morning," Catherine said. Charlotte nodded. "I helped a guard, I heard. And I'm very proud of you." Charlotte's eyes widened in surprise. Catherine smiled. "But tell me what happened. In your own words." As Charlotte recounted the story, Catherine listened carefully. She watched her daughter's face, saw the conviction there, the certainty that she'd done the right thing. When Charlotte finished, Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that Charlotte would remember for the rest of her life. Catherine set down her teacup carefully. She looked at her daughter with eyes full of warmth and something else. Pride. "Do you know what leadership is, Charlotte?" she asked. Charlotte thought about it. "It's being in charge." "Sometimes," Catherine said, "but real leadership is knowing when to use your voice, especially for people who can't use theirs." Charlotte nodded slowly, understanding. "That guard, Thomas, couldn't defend himself," Catherine continued. "If he'd argued back with Mr. Hartwell, he could have lost his job. He had no power in that situation." "But I did," Charlotte said quietly. "Yes, you did." Catherine reached across and took her daughter's hand. "And you used it wisely. You didn't shout or demand. You simply reminded Mr. Hartwell of something he'd forgotten, that every person deserves respect." Charlotte felt warmth spread through her chest. "Your great-grandmother would have been proud too," Catherine added. "She always said that our position isn't about being above others. It's about lifting others up." Charlotte smiled. She missed her great-grandmother terribly, but moments like this made her feel close again. "Will Mr. Hartwell be angry with me?" Charlotte asked. Catherine considered this. "Perhaps, but more likely he'll be embarrassed. And embarrassment can be a powerful teacher." There was a knock at the door. Prince William entered, still wearing his suit from an earlier engagement. "I heard we have a defender of justice in the family," he said with a grin. Charlotte laughed as her father swept her up in a hug. "Did Mama tell you what happened?" Charlotte asked. "She did. And I spoke to Thomas Hartley's commanding officer." William set Charlotte down, but kept his hands on her shoulders. "He wanted you to know that Thomas is grateful. Very grateful. I just did what was right," Charlotte said. William's expression grew serious. "That's all any of us can do, Lottie. Right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it." In the guard quarters, Thomas Hartley sat on his bunk, staring at the wall. His fellow guards had been coming to him all afternoon, some with congratulations, some with disbelief, all of them amazed. "Princess defended you," his friend Marcus kept saying. "An 8-year-old princess defended you." Thomas still couldn't quite believe it himself. His commanding officer had called him in earlier. Thomas had walked to the office with his stomach in knots, certain he was about to be reprimanded, maybe even dismissed. Instead, his commander had shaken his hand. "The Prince of Wales called personally," the commander said. "He wanted to make sure you were all right." And he said, Commander paused, choosing his words carefully. "He said that his daughter showed exactly the kind of character the royal family values, and that you handled the difficult situation with grace." Thomas had left that office walking on air now. Sitting in the quiet of his room, he thought about what had happened. About the little girl who'd stepped out from behind the roses, Who'd used her voice when his had been silenced? He thought about Jeffrey Hartwell's face. The shame, the anger, the forced apology, but mostly, he thought about Princess Charlotte's words. The guards here are the bravest people. I know. Thomas had joined the guard to serve, to protect, to be part of something bigger than himself. He'd never expected to be protected in return. Jeffrey Hartwell sat in his London office, staring at his phone. He'd made it back to the city, back to his normal life, but his hands were still shaking. What had he been thinking? Shouting at a guard. In the royal gardens? Where anyone could have seen. Where someone did see. His cousin. The one connected to the Lord Chamberlain had already called. The conversation had been brief and cold. I heard about your incident at Windsor, his cousin had said. I'd advise you to be more careful in the future. The line had gone dead. Jeffrey knew what that meant. His connection to the palace, already tenuous, was now hanging by a thread, all because he'd lost his temper with a guard. No, all because a child had witnessed him losing his temper. Jeffrey poured himself a drink. He thought about the princess's words, how we treat people. When no one important is watching shows who we really are. But someone had been watching. Someone very important. And now Jeffrey had to live with what she'd seen. Asterisk, asterisk. 3 days passed. Windsor Castle returned to its normal rhythm. Tourists came and went. Guards changed shifts. The royal family continued their duties, but something had shifted. Thomas Hartley noticed it first. The other guards looked at him differently now, not with pity or sympathy, but with something like respect. He'd been tested. He'd stayed silent when silence was required, and he'd been defended by a princess. In the strange hierarchy of the royal guard, that meant something. But Thomas noticed something else too. The way the staff interacted with the guards had changed. Small things. A cook bringing extra tea during a cold morning shift. A maid offering a smile and a nod. It was as if Princess Charlotte's actions had reminded everyone that the guards were people, not decorations, not furniture people. Charlotte was in her lessons when her tutor paused. Your Highness. I wanted to mention something, the tutor said carefully. Charlotte looked up from her history book. I've been teaching royal children for many years, the tutor continued, and I've learned that the most important lessons aren't always in books. Charlotte waited. What you did in the garden. That was a lesson. Not just for Mr. Hartwell or the guard, but for everyone who heard the story. What kind of lesson? Charlotte asked. The tutor smiled. That courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes courage is a small voice saying, this isn't right. Charlotte thought about that. She liked the idea of quiet courage. Will people remember? She asked. Oh yes, the tutor said. People always remember when someone stands up for what's right, especially when that someone is unexpected. In London, Jeffrey Hartwell was having a different kind of lesson. His phone had been quiet all week. Invitations that usually flooded his inbox had stopped. Colleagues who normally called had gone silent. He'd been iced out, not officially. No one had told him he was unwelcome. But in the subtle world of British high society, official statements weren't necessary. Everyone knew what he'd done, how he'd behaved, and more importantly, who had witnessed it. Jeffrey sat in his empty office and finally admitted something to himself. He was ashamed, not because he'd been caught, not because he'd lost social standing, but because a child had shown him what he'd become. He'd spent years climbing social ladders, making connections, using his family name to open doors. And somewhere along the way, he'd started believing he was more important than others, that his time mattered more, that his convenience outweighed someone else's dignity. An 8-year-old girl had shown him the truth. Jeffrey picked up his phone. He started typing an email, deleted it, started again. Finally, he wrote something simple. To the household of their royal highnesses. I would like to formally apologize for my behavior at Windsor Castle. I spoke to a member of your guard staff with disrespect and cruelty. There is no excuse for my actions. I have spent this week reflecting on who I want to be, Princess Charlotte reminded me that character is shown in how we treat others, especially those who cannot defend themselves. I hope someday to be worthy of the lesson she taught me, with deepest regret. Jeffrey Hartwell, he stared at the email for a long time. Then he pressed send. The email reached Prince William's secretary the next morning. The secretary read it twice, and forwarded it with a note. William read it during a break between meetings. He showed it to Catherine. Should we show Charlotte? Catherine asked. William considered. Not yet. She's 8. She doesn't need to carry the weight of changing someone's life, but she did change it. Catherine said softly, I know. Hey? William smiled. But let her be a child a little longer. She'll have a lifetime of carrying that weight. They decided to keep the letter. Someday, when Charlotte was older, they'd show her. They'd let her know that one moment of courage had ripples she never saw. 2 weeks after the incident, Thomas Hartley was standing his usual post when he saw someone approaching. His heart jumped when he realized it was Prince William. Your Highness, Thomas said. Snapping to attention, William stopped in front of him. At ease, Thomas? Thomas relaxed slightly, though his heart was still racing. I wanted to thank you, William said, for how you handled that situation in the garden. I didn't do anything, sir. Exactly, William said with a smile. You stayed professional under pressure. You didn't escalate. You trusted that the right thing would happen. Thomas nodded slowly. William's expression grew more serious. My daughter is learning what it means to be royal, what her voice can do, and you helped teach her something important, sir. That speaking up matters. That defending others matters. William put a hand on Thomas's shoulder. So thank you for being exactly the kind of person we want protecting our family. Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. It's an honor, sir. William nodded and turned to leave. Then he paused and looked back. Oh, and Thomas. Charlotte asks about you sometimes. Wants to know if you're all right? I thought you'd want to know that. Then the Prince of Wales walked away, leaving Thomas standing there with tears in his eyes. Part 6. Spring came to Windsor Castle. The roses in the East Garden bloomed red and white and pink. The morning sun warmed the stone walls, and life continued its eternal rhythm. Charlotte walked through the gardens with her mother, just as she'd done that morning weeks ago. But everything felt different now. Do you think about it? Catherine asked gently. What happened with the guard? Charlotte nodded. Sometimes, what do you think about? Charlotte was quiet for a moment, watching a bee move between flowers. I think about how scared he looked. Thomas, I mean, and how angry that man was. Mr. Hartwell. Yes. Charlotte looked up at her mother. Why was he so angry about something so small? Catherine considered how to answer. Sometimes people carry anger inside them, and when something frustrates them, even something tiny, all that anger comes out at once. It doesn't seem fair, Charlotte said. To the person they're angry at, I mean, it's not fair, Catherine agreed. That's why what you did mattered so much. They walked in silence for a while, Mama. Charlotte asked. Will I have to do things like that a lot? When I'm older? Catherine stopped walking. She knelt down so she was eye level with her daughter. Yes, she said honestly. Being who you are means using your voice. Standing up for people. Speaking truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Charlotte's eyes were serious. That sounds hard. It is hard, Catherine said. But you know what? I think you're already good at it. She pulled Charlotte into a hug. Over her daughter's shoulder, she saw Thomas Hartley at his post near the garden entrance. He stood tall and proud, the morning sun glinting off his uniform buttons. He caught her eye and nodded. Respectfully, Catherine nodded back. In London, Jeffrey Hartwell was sitting in a small cafe he'd never visited before. He'd stopped going to his usual haunts. The exclusive clubs, the expensive restaurants, places where everyone knew his name and his connections. Instead, he'd been seeking out quiet corners of the city, places where he could think. His phone buzzed. An email. He opened it and saw it was from a charity he'd heard of but never supported. They were looking for volunteers to help with fundraising. Jeffrey stared at the email for a long time. Then he clicked reply and started typing. Months passed. Summer turned to autumn. Autumn gave way to winter. Thomas Hartley continued his service to the royal family. He stood his posts, marched in ceremonies, and protected the people he'd sworn to protect. But he was different now. More confident, more certain of his worth. Other guards noticed. His commanding officer noticed. And when it came time for promotions, Thomas's name was at the top of the list. Charlotte sat in the palace library. Reading a book about Eleanor Roosevelt, she'd become fascinated with women who'd used their voices to change things. Women who'd stood up when others stayed silent. Her tutor had given her the book, thinking she'd enjoy it. She did. There was a quote that Charlotte kept coming back to. She'd underlined it in pencil, even though you weren't supposed to mark up books. No, and can make you feel inferior without your consent. Charlotte thought about Thomas Hartley, about how Geoffrey Hartwell had tried to make him feel small, but Thomas hadn't given his consent. He'd stood tall, even when someone was tearing him down. And Charlotte had reminded everyone watching that Thomas's dignity couldn't be taken away, only given up. She closed the book and looked out the window. The gardens were covered in a light snow. She wondered if Thomas was out there now. Standing in the cold, she hoped he was warm. On Christmas Eve, the royal family attended church at Sandring. The crowds were large, as they always were during the holidays. People lined the paths, hoping for a glimpse of the royals walking to service. Charlotte walked between her parents, her hand in her mother's. She wore a dark coat and a matching hat as they passed the crowds. Charlotte heard someone call out, "Thank you, Princess Charlotte." She turned, trying to see who'd spoken. A man stood at the barrier. He was young, wearing a veteran's pin on his coat. "Thank you for standing up for us," he called out. For the guards, it meant something. Charlotte smiled and waved, but she was confused. How did he know about the garden incident? That had been months ago, and it hadn't been in the newspapers. That evening, Catherine explained. "Stories like that travel," she said. "Maybe not in papers or on television, but person to person, heart to heart, so people know?" Charlotte asked. "Some people," Catherine said. "The people who matter? The people who understand what you did?" Charlotte thought about that. She liked the idea that some stories didn't need headlines to be important. On New Year's Eve, as fireworks exploded over London, Geoffrey Hartwell stood in his small flat and thought about the past year. He'd lost friends, lost invitations, lost his place in society, but he'd gained something too. Something harder to name. He thought about Princess Charlotte, about her clear, steady voice saying someone was watching. "Mr. Hartwell, I was watching." He'd spent his whole life trying to be important. It took a child to teach him the difference between importance and significance. Years would pass, Charlotte would grow up, would take on more duties, would step further into her royal role. She would speak at events, champion causes, use her voice in 100 different ways, and people would say they could see it coming. That moment in the garden, when she was 8 years old. The moment she learned that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and speaking up anyway. It's about seeing someone who needs defending and choosing to defend them. It's about remembering that every person, no matter their position or title, deserves to be treated with dignity. Thomas Hartley would go on to serve the royal family for 20 more years. He'd rise through the ranks, train new guards, and tell them about the day a princess defended him. Remember, he'd say, "You're not just protecting them. In the best moments, they protect you too." Geoffrey Hartwell would eventually rebuild his life, different, quieter, kinder. He'd volunteer at a charity that supported military veterans. He'd learn to listen more and speak less. And he'd carry a memory of a small girl in a blue dress, which shown him more grace than he deserved. But on that winter day at Windsor Castle, none of them knew how the story would end. They only knew that something had changed, that a moment of courage had rippled outward in ways no one could predict, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stand up and say, "This isn't right," And I'm going to do something about it, even if your voice shakes, even if you're small, even if you're afraid, especially then, because that's when courage matters most.